Good evening once again, everybody, and welcome to one of our monthly TFA webinars. I think we will be taking a short harvest / summer break after this one. But tonight we're going to be talking about trees are not the only way and simple steps to improving soil carbon. I think as tenants we'll be very pleased to hear that trees are not the only way, because that tends to be quite controversial and not always fit into our methods and ability to farm successfully. So it'll be really good to hear how we can go about improving soil carbon. And as we know, the whole direction of travel around biodiversity, carbon, regenerative farming is something that is coming increasingly on the agenda, both from DEFRA and also from private funding, and also probably from a simple farming point of view, in order to protect our soils and have, I think, was it something like 24 harvests were left a while ago, so hopefully extend that time. So really looking forward and really interested to hear from our speakers tonight, who I'll introduce in a moment. Just a little bit of background as well. We're very pleased once again that the series of webinars are being sponsored by Oxbury Bank. As you know, they're the new kids on the block and were founded just a couple of years ago in 2021 by bankers, farmers and technologists, and are the only UK bank that's 100% dedicated to serving farmers, food producers and the rural economy. I would encourage those of you that perhaps want to know a bit more about Oxbury to look back at one of our previous seminars around new entrants, where they were able to give us a very good insight and background into what they do. And it is refreshing to have somebody in the financial sector who I think are very good partners for us as tenants. So I'd really encourage you to go and have a look into what they do. And as I say, we're very grateful for their sponsorship of the series of webinars. As those of you that have attended before, you'll know that the webinar is recorded and edited, and it'll be available on our YouTube channel and on our website after the event. So if you want to go back and listen to stuff in more detail, or indeed you know somebody who wants to have a listen to it, that's where to find it. And as you'll know, there are quite a number from the previous few months around the ROC review, new entrants, the new DEFRA ELM scheme, and slurry storage and so on. So please take advantage of that. Anyhow, moving on to this evening's webinar, I'm really pleased to say we're joined by Tom Talput, who's a consultant from Terrafarmer, and James Wilcox, who's a TF member from Cornwall, who many of you, certainly in the southwest of the region, I'm sure will have come across JJ. So really welcome to you both this evening. A little bit of background to them both. Tom is the founder and consultant from Terrafarmer, and he's going to explore some of the very simple and practical steps that land managers can take to improve their production efficiency, while at the same time sequestering and storing greater amounts of carbon. And the carbon benefit can either be used for carbon balancing within the supply chain, or even traded as credits in the private market. He's based in Cornwall. He's an organic farmer. He's worked as a livestock nutrition consultant for over 25 years. He farms around 450 acres with his wife, Nicola, and they put regenerative and biological farming into practice. So it's really good to have somebody to listen to tonight who's been there, done that. So, you know, all credit to you, Tom, and really looking forward to hearing how that's been put into practice. And also, as I say, we're joined by James JJ Wilcox, who's TFA member, farms in partnership with his wife in North Cornwall, and he's a third generation tenant farmer operating on a FBT agreement. The main enterprise is 300 head of a crossbred autumn block calving dairy herd, and the cows are grazed from February to October. Sorry if I'm stumbling over this, JJ. Dairy isn't my forte, so I'm learning stuff even as I'm reading this. And they also farm around 750 acres with a mixture of cropping undertaken, including whole crop cereal mixes of barley, peas, clovers, and so on. And over the past few years, they've moved away from forage made and instead have undertaken trials using herbal ley. So again, we're lucky to have someone on the webinar tonight who's really trying to put this stuff into practice. So, and I think it's really good to be able to hear from people that are really doing and seeing the benefits and indeed the pitfalls of what we're doing. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Tom to you all, ask Tom to come and present to us around those topics. So good evening, Tom, and thank you very much for joining us.
Good evening all, and thank you very much for inviting me. I feel very honoured. We farm tenancies as well as share farming agreements, and so I think what you do is wonderful for us farmers. So my name's Tom. I farm in Cornwall. Have farmed for about 25 years. I wasn't going to be a farmer, but the lure of the land has taken me back to it. And I met JJ about 5 years ago, and if we go to our first sort of slide here, we farm on the south coast in between Lewes and Foy on the coast. We dry out very quickly. We've got very forgiving land, boys' ground, I think a lot of people term as upcountry. We farmed for about, like I say, 25 years, but and I worked as a nutritionist. I trained in America, was into very high input nutrition, but started to work in the UK and got to understand that those who managed their pastures, rotationally grazing, etc., were more profitable in many instances than some of the higher input businesses. And that gave me an encouragement to start looking at the soil. And then a chance meeting of the guy on the right, a chap called Gary Zimmer, at a OMSCO milk conference about 6 years ago, nearly to the day actually. He invited me to go over and spend sort of 10 days in America looking at sort of more regenerative and soil-based farming systems. It turns out he was an animal nutritionist in a previous life. And it's given me the sort of indication that the microbiology of the soil is very similar to a cow's rumen. When you get the balance right, you can get terrific efficiencies. A strong indication of that is an organic farmer. If I grow a 2-ton crop of oats, I think I'm doing all right. He was combining 7 tons an acre of organic grain maize by building biology, by building nutrition practices. And so I've sort of taken this a stage forward, and we look very much more at the soil as a biological entity, not just brown stuff. And I think this is going to be a very important part of our evolution as farmers, as we start treating the soil with a bit of respect. And of course, now, with this sort of spectre of soil carbon and the value within soil carbon, I think there's a terrific opportunity for farmers. Next slide, please. So we're agriculturalists, and there's been a lot of negative press about the way agriculture performs, especially livestock agriculture. And I hope today to give you some sort of pushback against that, because I guess that we're finding from a soil health point of view that livestock have their part to play. But as farmers, we're custodians of sort of 80% of the carbon left in the terrestrial soil. There's still a huge amount of carbon left in our soils. But if you look at the sort of the balance, what's been released through industrialization of both agriculture and industry, we have let the balance out of the bag, and it's only a fine balance. It's not as much as we think it is. An indication is if we rebuilt the soil organic matter on the prairies in the States, back by about 1.6% and restored the prairies to grasslands, we would start to return the soil, this carbon back to the soils. And over a period of time, an extended period of time, we would slow down and stop the consequences of the more CO2 in the atmosphere from a climate change perspective, by returning to pre-industrial levels. Next slide. An indication of this, and you as farmers, when you've had a soil analysis done and you've got an organic matter between sort of 3 and sometimes 16-18% organic matter, each 0.1, and this is the sort of the complexity a little bit, each tiny increase, 0.1% of an increase in organic matter is the equivalent of 8.9 tons of carbon drawn down from the atmosphere, and increases the soil carbon by about 2.5 tons. And it's this soil carbon that industry is so interested in. Please don't think that this is a fixed thing. Carbon comes and goes in the soil. The Earth or the Northern Hemisphere breathes in carbon into the soil over the summer as the plants are growing very, very intensively, and exhales in a way over winter. So when you are analysing for soil carbon, for soil organic matter, make sure you do it at a very similar time of year, because it changes over the cycle of the seasons. But you can't trade what carbon you don't know about or you don't have. And the most important part of this change is you. I've worked with JJ and some other dairy farmers over this sort of 4 or 5 years as we've got more and more involved in this soil carbon and soil health point of view. And at the start of the process, and I suspect George was similar, there's a little bit of skepticism around this regenerative agriculture. But in many ways, we hope to show it tonight, there's some very, very soft changes that you can make which help to the long-term health of your soil. Next slide, please. This is a map of soil biodiversity across parts of Europe. And you can see that across the west of Britain and Ireland and the wetter parts of Europe, where you've got mixed agriculture or livestock-based agriculture and rain, you've got very healthy soils. The blue areas are very healthy, high biodiversity soils. And these soils range between sort of 4 and 18% organic matter typically. Where you've got perennial cropping, grazed animals, animals grazing on the crops and perennial cropping, you've got healthier soils. Those plants, when they're growing up and photosynthesizing, are pumping down a glucose-like liquid into the soil to feed the biology, to feed the bacteria of the soil. And this is where we get increases in soil organic matter from, in many instances, from our soils. Perennial cropping, because you're not disrupting it or ploughing it or letting or exposing it back to the atmosphere, can start to build organic matter. Typically on our farm, the arable fields are half the organic matter of the perennial pastures. And I don't think that this holding on to soil and the importance of perennial cropping and soil health is being sort of shouted about. It certainly isn't from a lot of the anti-livestock brigade, but these perennial crops are responsible for holding gigatons of carbon in our farming cycles. And I think they need to be respected a bit more in terms of what they've actually prevented from releasing. You can see in the more arable areas and the drier areas that the soil biodiversity is much lower. Interestingly, you can almost overlay a soil carbon map over this, and it almost completely overlays, apart from some in the peat soils and that sort of thing. So mixed agriculture, wetter areas where you've got rain, where you've got livestock, you tend to have much healthier soils, and these soils would be as healthy and biologically diverse as virtually any part of the world. Globally, a 1% organic matter soil is a soil which is on the, which is just about in balance. It's just about okay. In the UK, I've never analysed a soil that sort of low. And I think the final thing to say is that it's easier to build soils, to build organic matter, to build soil health where you haven't got sandy soils. Sandy soils are very difficult to hold carbon and to hold organic matter, to build their health. So again, as part of a pragmatic approach to the individual farms that you're all farming, don't beat yourself up if you've got a low carbon sandy based farm, because it's very difficult for those soils to hold on to organic matter. Next slide, please. So regenerative agriculture, what are the key points of regenerative agriculture that we're about to see? Reducing tillage. Every time we till a field, plough, we expose more of the organic matter to the atmosphere, and we also disrupt the soil structure. Now, I'm not anti-ploughing per se, I'm anti-perpetual ploughing, but in many instances I get asked, has ploughing still got its place? Shallow ploughing is part of a rotation, and when you've earned the right to ploughing, can be an important part of your process. We're organic, we can't use glyphosate and the like, so tillage is part of our processes, but we are very much trying to reduce the amount of ploughing. And indeed, ploughing on a pasture which has been compacted by animals walking across it, we've actually seen a tripling in the earthworm by reintroducing into the plough into that rotation. But generally, in an arable situation, reducing the amount of tillage, keeping the soil structure as intact as possible, not ripping through the mycorrhizal and the root complexes within those soils is considered a positive thing, because you're exposing less soil to the atmosphere and there's less room for volatilization. Encouraging biological and ecological diversity, again, by cropping, putting herbal lays in, reintroducing clovers into pastures. All of these things are reintroducing livestock, indeed, in some situations, to farming situations, encourages this diversity. Every different plant that grows has a different rooting system and puts a different sort of root exudate. This sugary glucose mix that's pumped down into the soils, a deeper rooting plant pumps this carbon deeper into the soil and feeds a different part of the biology. Oats and things like that have a slightly more acidic root exudate. They help mobilize phosphorus from the soils. Different bacteria feed off this sort of mother's milk of the soil. So this root exudate feeds the biology. The bacteria go into the environment, find the minerals, and help bring the minerals to the plant. So the more that you build the biology, the more you build this ecosystem within the soil, the more access you get to the nutrients which are locked up in the soils. The third sort of root of it is reducing harmful impacts and inputs. We know that poorly applied nitrogen fertilizer applied in the wrong weather or onto a bare soil where little vegetation grows quickly back can actually burn carbon out of the soils. The figures vary when you look at research, between 16 kilos to 100 kilos of carbon burnt out of the soil for every kilo of nitrogen that isn't utilized by the soil. And I think that we've all, as farmers, we've all experienced over the last year with the huge variations in prices where we've used less nitrogen. We sometimes haven't had the yield collapse that we might have expected. But it goes even further. We're working more and more with farmers looking using foliar feeding, putting molasses on for and reducing nitrogen. So there's some great work going on where they are they're targeting a 9-ton crop of wheat. They're putting 150 kilos of nitrogen, but putting 50 kilos of molasses in that nutrition crop cycle as a carbon source to feed the biology when you're putting the nitrogen back into it, back into this idea about balancing the diet for the soil as well as animals. By putting a carbon source, by putting an energy source on with the nitrogen, you're getting better utilization. And farmers are generally reducing reducing nitrogen input by about 25%. This can be further sort of reduced by looking at the foliar root. And there's some great work going on in terms of reduction of nitrogen applications, looking at foliar feeding. But similarly, looking once farmers are on this sort of journey, they start reducing, as the soil biology builds, they're reducing things like fungicides within a farm season. They're targeting 9-ton yields maybe rather than 10-ton yields, but they're knocking out fungicides. It's not something that happens straight away. It's something that builds over a period of time, but it's another way that you can reduce the impacts. Fungicides obviously terribly harmful to the mycorrhizal networks of the soil. So by building the biology, by building the mycorrhizal networks, you're mobilizing phosphorus through the fungal networks and bringing more nutrients to that plant from the soil, so trying to increase its own immunity so you don't need so much fungicides. Maintaining ground cover being the fourth sort of pillar of this. We know that when a plant is photosynthesizing, it is pumping sugar solution into the soil, glucose into the soil. If a crop is growing 10 tons of dry matter, you've got 4 or 5 tons of carbon being pumped down into the soil. But if you have a fallow period, there's nothing to feed that biology. You're not putting the sugar into the soil to feed the biology. So the biology starts dying away, and you may be losing carbon. As those bacteria die and they get exposed, they may volatilize off into the atmosphere. So maintaining ground cover crops or undersowing is a crucial part of making sure that soil has always got its life support system from its cropping. And then more controversially, not probably to us as a group discussing things, but the integration of livestock, where practical, the grazing of livestock and the fertilization of livestock through grazing animals is very, very important. When you think about the analogy of the rumen and the soil being broadly not dissimilar sort of ecosystems, the refertilization of those soils through manures and through urea, through urine and things, it is very, very important. But the caveat to that is that to get the best out of it, it's very much a rotational grazing system rather than a set stocking system. The ability for the plant to have rest within its cycle is very important, because if you overgraze it, if you get to the point where the grazing tip is taken out, the plant can't sustain its root system, and so starts cutting off its own roots, so that it can't sustain the depth of the roots. And an analogy of that is that quite often in a set stock situation, the crop will go dry quicker in a dry time. It's the permanent pastures, which are set stock, which often run out of water first, as opposed to the rotationally grazed herbal lays and things, which are on a graze and rest period. Next slide, please. This is the reason I put this on this. This is Gabe Brown. He's one of the sort of trailblazers within sort of the regenerative route, and he tried many things on his farm. He took on a farm in the very early 90s. Tried no-till. There's a lot of groundswell has been on last week, and the plough has had a bit of a kicking through that process. But no-till, he tried no-till, and he started to rate at this organic matter. And his organic matters at 1% are typical of a global soil. A lot of it in Africa, a lot of it in Australia, and certainly within the Americas. So he started at a typical global starting point, which we are much, much better. Tried no-till, increased the crop diversity. So he's coming up in towards the end of the 90s, not making the progress he'd hoped to do. So he's, but we're up to nearly 2% now. We're in 1996, 97. And then it sort of flatlines. We're using cover crops at this point now, and we are building things. We're up to sort of, we're aiming towards the 3% organic matter, but we're in the mid-noughties now. He then brought the biodiversity back in, mixed species cover crops, typically between a 4 and sort of 8-way cover crop, many different species, or four major different species within that, but a mix of these cover crops started to, like we were saying earlier, the more complexity above the ground, the deeper the roots and the different root exudates below the ground. And so you're feeding the different parts of the biological network with this sugar solution. And then in livestock integration, and that's where the carbon acquisition really takes off. And I suspect within the next sort of 20 years, if I were a younger farmer than I am, God forbid, we might be in the situation where livestock, where shepherd's huts are actually used for shepherds, integrating livestock within an arable rotation. We've seen a tripling of earthworms where we've produced just an 18-month lay into an arable rotation, which was grazed by sheep. The improvement in the biology was remarkable. We in the UK have a terrific reserve of the different species within our soils. We've just got to access to them and give them the opportunity to thrive. And perennial crops, where suitable, where they work within a rotation, can be part of that. And this sort of anti-livestock narrative, when it comes to soil health, when it comes to soil carbon, I think is something that we really have to challenge. Next slide, please. So a couple of case studies for you, based in Cornwall, based on some characters that we've met, JJ being one of them. So we were approached by a dairy to understand how they could reduce the impact of carbon within their production cycle. We met some of the farmers within the pool, but the main outline of the project was to reduce the carbon footprint of the farms, to collect baseline data, to become more environmentally sustainable, and to reduce the farm carbon footprints. And they were the main objectives of it. Next slide, please. And so practically, as time's cracking on, practically, how could we help these farmers on this journey? They all had good grazing management practices. They plate metered, but we've tried to bring some more diversity into the rotation. We've analysed and used the slurries to a much greater extent. Regenerative farmers or biological farmers tend to look at slurry as an important nutrient now, and it's helped us reduce fertilizer use fairly dramatically. Where possible, we've gone away from annual cropping and introduced things like lucerne instead of maize, lucerne being a protein crop with a sort of a 3 to 4 year, 5 year lifespan. So not only are we reducing tillage on those fields, but we're reducing the amount of bought-in proteins into our farm. We've reviewed fertilizer policy. Some of the fertilizers the farmers were using were already well balanced. They were using humates as part of the complexity of the fertilizers. So a lot of them were good, but we've challenged them, and we so far, droughts allowing, we're managing to maintain yield by dramatically reducing fertilizer policy. And like I said before, adding complexity to the lays, it's not a full GS4 type scenario. JJ has his own name for one of his, which I'll let him talk about later, but adding some deeper rooting species, adding clovers back into lays, having different rooting depths, fixing nitrogen, all of these things are helping hugely in the journey of the soils. So what does this look like on the next slide? So we took a baseline. We have 5 of these machines going across the UK where we can do 1, 2, or 3 depth sampling. On the top of the machines is a GPS marker. So every time we take a sample, it's marked. We take 16 samples in a 4-meter circle. And as the samples are pulled out of the ground, a label comes out and we stick on the label, and the lab is informed that these samples are to be expected. So we have a sort of a closed circuit with the laboratory. It goes straight into them. They already know they're coming to try and reduce any human error. And we plot these onto maps, and these maps help dramatically in farmers understanding what their farm looks like. And that will come up on the next slide, I'm hoping. And this is another farm in Cornwall, not very far from me. So we took a baseline in 2020. Now we did PK, magnesium, pH, and organic matter, and this is the organic matter results. And in this period on this farm, but you'll see that what we're looking for is to turn greens into blues, into light blues or dark blues. You're trying to indicate an increase in organic matter. And this farm did a lot of these processes, but the organic matter increase was very slight. It was about 126 tons over the full 300 hectares. And what I'm trying to explain to you is that even with good practice, with weather interventions, with grazing, with a bit of poaching, with a bit of tillage, carbon is not a linear thing. And I would be very upset if you heard people explaining it was linear. It's not. It can go both ways. We've had 2 dry summers in the southwest, and we are probably losing organic matter because of that. The flip side of that, if we go on to the next slide, is that where the weather and the farming goes with you, you can have a dramatic increase. Now, don't worry about the numbers in particular, but what I want you to sort of take on the overview is it's slightly bluer. The map on the right in 2022 is bluer than 2020. We went back to exactly the same spots with the same machine and sampled the soils in the exact same areas, reanalyzed them at the same time as the other farm. The other farm did 126 tons. This farm did over 8,000 tons of carbon in that period. Now, we're still working with the universities and drilling down into why this is, but I'm showing you this from a baseline. The value in this is tremendous compared to a lot of the schemes that we are being offered as farmers to sign up to, where you're given a stipend to do or not do things. If you take ownership of your own data and you farm sensitively, and the weather and everything is with you, you have an opportunity to help finance the sort of the succession or the next step in your farming business. I'm aware that we're running on time here. So next slide, please. Oh, that was it. That was the last slide. So yes, I hope that gives you a very speedy snapshot of where we're at, and back to you, Mark and JJ, for comments and things.
Tom, brilliant. Thank you very much for that. I think, I don't know about anybody else but listening, but I've managed to fill a whole side of A4 with questions partly, but also of thoughts about what we're doing. We've kind of dipping our toe in this water just now. So I'm pleased to see that some of the things you were talking about we're doing. quite a lot of the stuff we're probably not yet. But no, really, really good overview, and I suspect it's something you could we could spend the whole evening talking about and letting you run on. But I think let's move on to some Q&A around this. Although, JJ, I wonder if I don't know if you could take, I don't know, 3 or 5 minutes on just sort of explaining, I hate this phrase, your journey on working with Tom and the kind of things that perhaps you've implemented and seen, the changes you've made on the farm, maybe why you made those changes as well before we go into Q&A. I don't know if you could give us a quick... Yeah. It might take longer than 5 minutes, but yeah.
Yeah, I'll try and be brief as the time is going on. I mean, farming, it is a journey, to use that kind again, but it's over a long period of time. We've been doing this throughout my farming career, through my dad's tenancy, through my tenancy, but it's all to do with making little changes. And I think if a lot of people sort of logging in today and looking, it's what we've been doing anyway. Myself personally, perhaps it's the way I've always farmed, but it's simple things, just like keeping a crop in the ground, keeping your soils covered in some green, put a cover crop in after you take your corn off. It's things that I was doing and wasn't even realizing I was doing it. And now with someone like Tom on board and other people like Tom, you've got some science to back it all up. You're doing the right things. You're building carbon from the evidence that proved from our soil analysis. And the other little things for myself as a relatively intensive dairy farmer, we're autumn block, as you said at the start. So traditionally, we still house the cows in the winter, obviously, but traditionally we would push them a lot harder through the winter. We would always feed maize because we thought we had to, because we've always grown maize for 35 years all through my farming career. And all of a sudden we sort of, why are we growing maize? We're not a 10,000 litre herd. We do 8,000 litres, depending on grazing, depending on forage. So last year we cut out the maize completely on a sort of a trial basis. We just mainly fed spring sown whole crop last year with a small trial with peas and barley. The peas and barley worked really well last year. So we've done 60 acres of that this year. So the maize has gone out the window, we threw soya out the window, threw palm out the window, and we're still doing the same yield we were doing from much more sustainable crops that are better for the soils, that are better for the cows. And the bonus is we've entered into a mid-tier, so we get payments for mid-tier on growing the spring sown whole crops. And it's all to sort of gradually building to a positive outcome from it. I mean, I could go more and more, like you said, but I'm really want people to engage and try and ask me questions, and we can carry on that way.
Yeah, no, Jojo, that's great. I think probably the key phrase that you used there is that it's something you've always been doing, and I think, and I'd be interested in your view on some of this, Tom, as well. I think there's a risk at the moment that the sort of regenerative approach is getting a label of being terribly innovative, and it's never been done before, and it's all kind of very scary. But it appears to me that what the difference is between perhaps what certainly our grandfathers were doing and probably our fathers, in the 60s and 70s, was a form of regenerative farming. The difference is now we have a lot more science around what the result of that regenerative, if we call it regenerative, nature-based approach is. We've got a lot more science around it to back up the results of the actions that we're taking. I don't know, Tom, if you would agree with that, or whether we're just sort of blinding ourselves with science.
No, not at all. I think that our forefathers and foremothers, in terms of their farming skills, that if you imagine you were ploughing an acre a day at 3 inches, you did it for 40 years, you really knew what that soil was, what that farm was. In the southwest we have lime kilns, and they were burning limestone, and burnt limestone is 100 times more available than a lot of ground rock limestone for pH adjustment. Calcium is a really important part of a nutrient for moving nutrients around a plant. So I genuinely believe for the 800 years that they evolved their farming, they really started to understand what it was. After the Second World War, we had a glut of chemicals which are quite good for making bombs, being phosphorus, potassium, and nitrogen, and we've turned them into crop nutrients. The 2 generations older than us use those very wisely to feed the world, and they use them with the best of science. But now the science is saying, we can test these things now. We can look at organic matter, we can look at available nutrients, we can sap test plants. And the data is coming back saying that some of them have been quite harmful. As an animal nutritionist, I spend a lot of time balancing chloride in our forages. We've used MOP potassium, MOP as a fertilizer, which is potassium chloride. Well, the potassium is great for the plant. The chloride is a bacterial killer that we put in water, you know, and it remains in the soil. So we've got higher and higher chlorides. So I respect the way our forebears farmed hugely. They farmed with real observation, but now the science is backing up the way they farmed, and it makes a huge. But you're quite right. If we observe from nature, the grazing rotations, where, you know, for a million years herbivores and grasses have evolved together. They evolved. The grass grew, the herbivore came in, they grazed it. The saber-toothed tiger, the wolf came in, they moved on, and the plant grew again. It'd been fertilized, it had been stimulated by grazing, and so the nature-based systems are there. But the science is only now catching up with what I think is the best of practice.
Yeah, no, I think I would agree with that, and it's really good. I think it's backing up some of the actions that you're recommending that we take. Okay, we'll crack on. I would just remind everybody, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll try and pick them up. We've had quite a number of questions sent through prior to the event that both JJ and Tom have had the opportunity to have a look at, but perhaps I'll just start on what I think is probably quite close to certainly a lot of tenants, but a lot of farmers' hearts, probably full stop, is what is the, or how do tenants, particularly on short-term tenancies, can we ensure that we're going to reap the financial returns that this type of change to a management system might deliver? And I'm thinking particularly of people on, let's say, 3 to 5 year tenancies, where the rewards of changing the management system may not come through until year 6, 7, 8, where they may not have the tenancy, or maybe that's not a true reflection of how this works. And JJ, I'll be interested in your view on this as to where you've seen the kind of financial benefits and how quickly they've come as well. So perhaps that's a question to both of you.
Well, we started this process with Tom 4 years ago now, and we've already dropped our nitrogen inputs by about 50%, as in ammonium nitrate, on our grazing and our silage ground. So there's immediate saving then, cash that is, and also with organic matter gain. I know there's the trading days of soil carbon are very early days yet, but our soil organic matter has gone in some fields from 8 to 12 in the extremes. So we are gaining in a very short period of time from stopping the maize. We're not, like Tom says, still is a time and a place for a plough, but we've gained quite considerable organic matter in less than 3 or 4 years. I know that's still not great for someone in a 3-year tenancy, but I think that's something that's going to come more and more in the future with even short-term tenancies. The value of having a baseline when you start day one and when you finish in the end of the 5th or 3rd year, and if you've gained something, then you should get some remuneration for that. I mean, it's something, I don't know if George is still listening in, but that's something perhaps George might comment on, have more information on that.
Yeah, I'll ask George in a moment just to comment on that maybe. Tom, I don't know if you've got some views on the financial returns.
Yeah, I think that I'm in the livestock area, and I appreciate that we've got a lot of arable people within this group as well. I mean, certainly the targeting of nutrients. If the tenancy lasts long enough for the SFI can be used as a vehicle to do all the soil sampling. It will certainly cover the soil sampling and give you a baseline for that. Where people adopt the best practice, reducing tillage. I mean, there's often sort of 30-40 pound a hectare saving and reduced tillage. Targeting nitrogen, you can save another sort of 25% of your nitrogen inputs. You do put some back in with molasses or humates or whatever you're balancing that with. going to foliar, the efficacy of foliar is so much higher. Cover crops, if you've got an opportunity to do a cover crop within a rotation, you are building nutrients. When you incorporate a cover crop, especially if you incorporate it green, you are all the minerals and proteins and sugars within the leaf are then there to feed the biology. And when the biology cycles, you start to build nutrients and things. So every farmer's got to look at their own strengths and weaknesses, but just taking a step back and thinking, well, you know, what works for me? What's the bit for me that out of all of those sort of different ideas, that's a key. I think the key to the evolution of farming at the moment is just being able to just question everything and take the bit that suits you, because you don't have to go all into this. You know, you can't, if you're in the middle of Lincolnshire with not a cow for 5 miles around you, I'm not going to ask you go into a rotational grazing situation, but there is opportunities within the sciences as they're developing. But it's up to the farmer to ask the question and go and seek the answers in many ways.
And do you think, and JJ, you may be able to answer this as well, because I know, so I've heard people say it, that if you're going to go down this route in the first, I don't know, 3 to 5 years of it, you would expect to suffer some kind of yield reduction. For example, if you're taking, you're reducing your input, your fertilizer inputs. Is that just sort of pub talk to put us off doing it, or is that reality? Is there a kind of, your inputs will go down, it'll take some time to build that goodness in the soil to go back to your original yield levels, whether that be from livestock or from arable, or is that not the case? Is that a bit of a myth?
I think that's, to be honest, that is a myth. We reduced our inputs in the first year, and we didn't have any knock-on effect from our yield from our cows. I'm probably fortunate that we've been farming this way for several years, so our soils are in pretty good nick anyway. Just by cutting some inputs into it, we gained, well, we didn't gain yield on the cows per se, but we cut a lot of inputs for fertilizer. We stopped growing maize, which is a lot more expensive than growing a spring sown whole crop. So that made massive differences straight away. It's relatively small changes that to make the sort of bigger returns on it, really.
So you're actually seeing an improved margin, even. But you're certainly not seeing significant yield reduction, which some people will have us believe might be the case.
No, and just going back to my comment about maize, I'm still a fan of maize in a way, because my dad just said there's no substitute for growing maize, but depending what sort of yield you're after, you can still grow great maize. We could still probably grow maize now. The last couple of years we did it, we undersowed it with grass every time, had really good results of grass for the winter, took a cut of the ryegrass in the spring, and it was fantastic. So there still are ways of growing maize in a really regenerative way, if you want to use that word. So I'm not against maize at all, but it just doesn't work for us. We don't need it.
Yeah. George, I wonder, could you just add something around a sort of a typical tenancy issue, which is, what is the value of the quality of soil, if I can put it as broadly as that? So if I baseline on year 0, when I come into a tenancy, I don't know what the score would be, 10, and I baseline again in year 5, and my score is 15, I'm using those numbers just as random numbers. Is that 5 that I've increased? Is there a value for that? And if so, how does anybody establish that in a landlord tenancy situation?
Yeah, Mark, really interesting to follow what's been said tonight already. And I think my answer to your question is to say that there should be a value, but at the moment it is really hard to assess what that value is, because the way in which agricultural end of tenancy matters are promoted tend to relate back to the productive capacity of the holding. So you're always looking at it on the basis of, well, what level of benefit have you created from a productive aspect of the holding? The whole idea of valuing carbon and valuing biodiversity within soils is something which is still very much in development, and we are waiting for the land agency profession to catch up with that, if you like. But I think what's really important here, and what we oughtn't to lose sight of, is, very often when we talk about natural capital, we talk about carbon, we talk about biodiversity, very often we're almost being led to believe that this is not the tenant's bailiwick. This is not something the tenant could be interested in because the landlord wants to take advantage of those things. But what Tom and JJ have gone through tonight are very simple, straightforward, understandable, practical things, which really puts the whole gamut of benefit back into the hands of the tenant farmer. So, we use the phrase, trees are not the only way, because that's what the reportage says. But there's real benefit to be had here on conversations with your supply chain and conversation with the people that you're selling stuff to, indeed creating credits for use more widely. The sort of stuff that we're talking about here provides potentially immediate benefit to the tenant, both from a perspective of creating a healthier environment within which their businesses will thrive, but also providing some financial benefit for them as well immediately within the supply chain. So we don't have to wait until the end of the tenancy to get the benefit. We're getting it throughout the term of the occupation, and I think that's what Tom and JJ are really giving the tenant sector, giving this whole issue back to the tenant farmer rather than what we've seen recently, which is almost like it's being taken away from the tenant because the landlord wants to take access to it.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, it's kind of early days, isn't it, with any of this value? But I think what I'm hearing, and I've heard a little bit from others, and certainly I guess we're starting to practice this a bit at home, but certainly hear it from Tom and JJ tonight, is that actually this is just good farming practice, which makes financial sense. It's not rocket science. It's just good farming, and it makes good financial sense. Thanks, George, for that. I think there's a long way to go, isn't there, in terms of how this all gets valued and in the thing. I'm just gonna move on a little bit onto perhaps some sort of slightly more practical questions that we've got in the chat. Helen Radmore, who's our treasurer at the moment, and farms up on Dartmoor. So she asks, what type of livestock wormers do the least damage to soil with grazing animals? We're getting into the nitty-gritty now, Tom.
Well, again, because we've gone to rotational grazing, we don't use wormers and things now. We used to do it annually. We're using herbal lays in rotation. We're certainly all herbal lays. We're probably only 25% herbal lays in our rotation. So it's questionable whether we're getting an anthelmintic effect. But because we are going into a rotational grazing situation, we don't seem to be getting the buildup of disease. We do fecal egg counts. We do things in the proper manner, but we're not finding the buildup. We used to have terrible trouble with liver fluke and things like that, but we have got a few rattles at the moment in terms of some lungworms in some calves. We just tested and they've come back negative, so it might not be lungworms. So as a rule, you use a heck of a lot less. And I think this is the other thing from a regenerative or biological farming situation. When it starts to go right for you, you spend a lot less money. You're able to retain a lot more money within your farming system.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, interesting. On a similar, while we're on to the detail, Rob Garrett asked, what is the cost of soil sampling? And perhaps I could just broaden that a little bit into, I think we're talking about what is the cost of baselining, and also what do you need to include in your baseline assessment in order for it to be of real value. We're used to doing some soil samplings, but typically sort of NP and K, and often not including organic matter. So I guess there's a bit of a wider thing there. But what should we be budgeting for to get to a baseline assessment to know where we're at, really?
I mean, it's such a variable question. Some people sample every hectare. Some people do 2 depths. Some people do 2 hectares at a single depth. Your baseline can cost between £5 and £15 an acre, depending. 15 would be utterly, going mad at it, sort of thing. So what you find is that if it's a larger farm, what we recommend is that you do 1/3 of the farm a year. And by the time, this is for the people on the longer term tenancies, I suppose, but by the time they come to the 4th year, the farmers are incredibly eager to see what's happened. And so it's a very, it's a typical farm might spend £1,500 a year. They've generally saved that in fertilizer straight away. They're building a sort of an asset base in terms of they've got a nutrient management plan under, they can know where to target nutrients and where not to do them. So there's a saving then. And by the 4th year, if they've made changes, they should be measurable changes. When we're getting excited about 0.1% of organic matter, might take a farm to a carbon neutral status, you've got to accurately resample. And that's why I think the GPS has, certainly from our point of view, as a small scale farmer, it has resilience. And I'm not sure about the carbon market yet. As we've said, so there's two things there. It's the Wild West, and I would be very careful about getting plugged into schemes now, but knowing where you are, and building of organic matter is simply the byproduct of good farming, reducing tillage, all of the things we've talked about. If you build organic matter, it's an indication that you're probably farming in a better, more sustainable manner. And so, so there's benefits in kind from building organic matter. There's a long-term potential value in terms of that may well have a greater value down the line through proper baselining. And we're being told, because we are GPS marking it and control depth sampling, if that becomes a thing, the highest value will be attached to those things. But I very much want farmers to farm to their best degree, and the carbon thing might come rather than expecting it to ride over the horizon like Tonto and his horse with a sack of gold on the back.
Yeah. And I guess that's the point you're kind of making, isn't it? It's farming in the right way, doing the right things to produce a sustainable farming system, rather than thinking there's some great market that I'm going to cash in on next year or the year after in what we do. JJ, I wonder what I mean, if you don't have to share this with us, but I wonder what it cost you to baseline in the first instance, or whether you did, or how you went about that.
Well, Tom very mentioned we were quite fortunate. We were part sponsored with our dairy because they were very keen to get on board with this. So we were more probably the £15 sort of limit. So we had the whole works. So we were quite fortunate with that. And since then we're now going only, like Tom said, part of the farm per year. But yes, again, we were very fortunate with that. But that knowledge we've got just from that first year of sampling, I don't know what it saved us. I couldn't really go into the details of that, but with the map that Tom put up, it's so easy to pinpoint. You can click on each field, you can go to the point, you know exactly what is in each field. So that cut our inputs dramatically in year one, or fertilizer application for year two, if you like. So yeah, I can't really put a value on it. If you can, go the whole hog, but if not, at least do a baseline of your approximately £5 per acre and get it done. Or like Tom suggested, do 25% of your farm. And just going back to, if you're still a bit dubious on sort of not growing maize, or just try a small part of your farm. Just try some peas and barley. Just try a bit of undersown grass in your maize. Just try it for a year and see how you get on with it. That'd be my sort of practical way of making a start at it.
Yeah. Okay. We've also got a question here, Tom, from James Sellers, who says, how have you integrated grass into an arable rotation? Is it worth putting grass in for 1 year, or what is the the best number of years to include it without hurting the arable economics? And I guess perhaps I could just add to that is, as somebody farming in a predominantly arable area, not quite central Lincolnshire, but not far away, actually integrating livestock into the system is quite challenging given the number of livestock around. And I wonder whether there's any move or any way of attracting livestock farmers to almost pool their resources better with arable farmers, because I think there's perhaps a demand for this, where you can see the benefit of integrating livestock into the system. But as somebody, we do have livestock, but as lots of people in our area who don't, they're not livestock people. So integrating livestock might be a bit challenging from a management point of view. You're on mute, Tom.
The two instances that come to mind is one, a hard farm in the Dorset Wiltshire borders on the chalks. They integrated livestock into an arable farm, a very hard farm. The soil was very hard, very dead, really. And they have seen they put a 3-year herbal lay into a rotation, got other stock into graze. That was an advantage for them, and they will tell you that for the 2 years subsequent, the inputs are less and the ground is easier to work because of the herbal lay in the situation. The other one that comes to mind is and the one that we cited in the text was where again, because of a neighbouring opportunity, an 18-month clover and ryegrass layer was introduced just as a break crop. So they went from a winter cereal combined into grass, 18 months out the following spring into a spring crop. And they again felt that there was huge regenerative powers within that, but they both of those played to their strength. There was opportunity to do that. The third thing that comes to mind is there is a lot of sheep that sort of come out of places like Wales, and we've been offering them ourselves, store lambs and things, and the infrastructure through mobile fencing and water and things like that is a definite opportunity to graze cover crops, so that just get 6 months, 5 months of a crop in the ground, and get everybody calls it the golden hoof. I think it's more the golden poop. I'm coming convinced it's the active grazing, and what comes out the back end of them is the goodness within it. So those, you've got to play to your strengths if you have any in an agricultural situation. I'm certain there's long-term links to be made with store lambs and things like that into a rotation. But for those 5 months, you will need somebody who can tell which way a sheep up is to work with you. So yeah, it's playing to your strengths. I think it's 18 months, but the benefits can be for more than 1 year following.
Right. Okay. Maybe we're going to see Lincolnshire populated by shepherd's huts over the next 5 years. That'll be interesting. I know we're a bit tight for time, but I'm going to squeeze in 2 last questions. I see we've been joined by, I'm going to get this pronunciation horribly wrong, so I'll apologise before I go. But we've been joined by Dr. Obaid Rahman, who's the Chief Scientist and Director of the Soil and Water Conservation Research Institute in Pakistan. And he asks, what is the easiest way to raise and maintain soil organic matter up to 1.6% as desired? I think we could probably all still ask that question about what is the easiest way to improve soil organic matter. So was your top tip for the evening, Tom?
The problem there's a global discussion going on. It's very difficult where you've got low rain, which I know Pakistan has quite a lot of rain in places, sometimes too much. One of the things that I think will make a genuine impact is by putting cover on the crops. Last year we were measuring where we had a growing herbal lay and we had a tightly grazed pasture, and there was a huge variation in the temperature of the soils. You start to get soils above 25, 30 degrees centigrade, you start killing the bacteria, you get up to 40 and you've really got a problem. So in an extreme environment, it's getting that initial cover on the ground so that you can reduce the extremes of heat, so you don't kill the biology. You get your cover cropping in, whatever that is, and you hope for rain. If you've got those two, and it's not a sandy soil, you've got half a chance. But it's a long-term project. But getting that cover on the ground, reducing the extremes of heat. This is why it's so difficult after they clear rainforest in around the sort of the equator. It's so hot there that once the cover is gone, the soil gets so hot and you kill the biology. And all of what we're trying to encourage today is building the biology of the soil. And once you've got the biological cycles, you'll start to build organic matter. But it's a big question, and that's a very, very tabloid answer, I'm afraid.
I mean, just briefly, Michael, everybody watched it. The fields that we gained our most organic matter in the first year were our permanent pasture fields. Fields have been a permanent pasture for forever. And we just didn't put, we normally go out and stick 50 units to put nitrogen on it every year, so 3 times a year. These are steep fields that we don't graze heavily with anything, but we reduced the grazing on them considerably. We didn't touch them basically, and they gain the most with the proper permanent, old-fashioned permanent pasture, proper meadow fields. They gain the most in the first 12 months.
Right, interesting, yeah. Thank you both very much. I'm going to ask this one last question. I realise we're over time, but it was asked by a member from Cornwall who may be the same person who's put it in the chat, so it's clearly quite pressing. Is Super Soil making a presence on social media as an Irish bacteriological dressing? Is it worth considering to improve soil rather than fertiliser?
Quick answer is it's worth a try, but honestly, if you're in the west of Britain, you've got a terrifically diverse soil full of bacteria in broad terms, and I don't think there's much room for other soils to be in. You very rarely get a welcome an army of other things come into a soil and they say come and live with us. It's not that. You've got a very established environment, and I think it's likely that the impact will be great. If you're in a dry soil and there is no livestock and it's a very arable rotation, I think it's worth a go, but you need to remember to feed it. So if you do put it on, put something on, put a cover crop on, or put some molasses on, or put something to feed those bacteria, because you can't send them into battle without a lunchbox.
I mean, just briefly on that, Tom. Just talking about fertilizer, as you mentioned a couple of times, we've been using humate-based fertilizers for 10 years or more. So we haven't used any straight nitrogen or urea for years. Humate does work a little bit like a soil conditioner. Tom would know more details on that. It was more through we stumbled into that, we persuaded to do it. And I think that has helped us compared to the other farm on our project. They were using straight urea, straight nitrogen. I think that helped us with our baseline, just using humates rather than straight fertilizers or straight nitrogens, that is.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Brilliant, guys. Tom, JJ, thank you so much. I think we could literally carry on all evening on this. There's so much to learn and to discuss around this whole area. But I would go back to JJ's initial comment about something along the lines of we've been doing this for years and it just makes the difference. And also, I think the key element that I pick up from this is that actually it's just a good way of farming, not just for the environment, but also financially it works. And it's about making the best use of your skills and your soil and the assets that you have on all the particular farms. And the clearly, whilst we all like to think we can benchmark as our farms are all the same as next door, they're simply not. They're individual places. So it's really good to hear that. And thank you very much, Tom, and thank you, JJ. Thank you also, obviously, to Oxbury as our sponsors. And as I said earlier, we're taking a short break over the summer months. And we're going to be back on the 27th of September, where we're going to be joined by Janet Hughes again, who's the DEFRA Programme Coordinator, and Marie Hardman, who's the RPA Customer Director, to discuss more about the 2023 SFI rollout. Which I'm sure many of you saw hitting the rate. I was going to say hitting the buffers. That wouldn't be bad. They're not hitting the buffers yet, surely. Hitting the rails and getting up and running, and that was announced last week. So Janet and Marie will be here in September to talk us through that. So please join us for that. And if you missed anything of this evening, we didn't get around to answering all the questions, so I will ask Tom and JJ if they'd be good enough to pass some of the answers on to Julia, and we'll put those up on the website for you. So once again, thank you very much. Sorry for overrunning. Please go away and have a good evening. Thank you very much.